Hello, all of you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Meryl Gordon. I'm the director of the magazine program at NYU's Arthur Carter Journalism Institute. And I'm pleased today to have our guest, Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, and Ian Fisher. I've already, I had it all written down, who was a foreign correspondent, now the digital editor. And in the interest of full disclosure, since we're always all about full disclosure, Arthur and I have known each other since the late 1970s when we were both reporters in Washington. So, I wanted to start by talking about the major investigative story that the New York Times broke yesterday on page 1 about the discovery of old chemical weapons in Iraq and how American soldiers discovered them, got hurt, and weren't allowed to talk about them. Now, can you tell me a little bit about, this is the kind of story that wins Pulitzer Prizes, but doesn't necessarily...
Don't curse us.
Doesn't necessarily, it's not a, quote, a money maker. Can you tell us a little bit about how this story came about? How early did they come to you to pursue this project, and what was your involvement from the top?
Okay. Well, I'm going to do the thing that a good newspaper publisher does best. I'm going to turn it over to Ian.
I think so.
I will say just one thing about the story and then turn it over to Ian, which is to say that this was 2 years in the making. Chris Chivers worked on this remarkable story. How many of you saw this story yesterday?
Great.
Wonderful. You're not alone. This story in only 2 days is in the top 20 of the most read stories of the year. Of the year. And this is, as you know who read it, a major dive. But Ian was a foreign correspondent, was on the foreign desk for a number of years.
Was Chris's editor
and can speak eloquently about this
volumes. No, about Chris anyway. Hi, glad so many of you read the piece, which was really fantastic. Chris actually started that story about 2 years ago. He'd been going in and out of various dangerous places, including Iraq and Syria, before it really got way too dangerous for anybody to go there. And on his off time, he started hearing, he got a couple tips that there actually had been chemical munitions found in Iraq. Now, it was interesting. I mean, I was in and out for 2 years in the very beginning, and occasionally a chemical shell would pop up, but no one made much of a big deal out of it because they were all very, very old. And so Susan had asked, who gave this to you? Chris heard one rumor, tried to track down people, had a very hard time finding people. It was only because Chris is a former Marine and was something of an expert on munitions that he very slowly and painstakingly got them to talk. And it turned out that it wasn't just a handful of old shells, it was in fact 5,000 shells. That had been sort of stashed all around the country, chemical weapons, nerve gas, et cetera, that had, again, injured American soldiers who were urged to hush it up. So it really became a story about secrecy and what secrecy does to individual lives of, these soldiers.
And thank you. And
I mean, had they? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No. It's the point that Chris makes. It was kind of like in the beginning, if they had merely said, "Okay, yeah, we found this shell and that shell," it would have been a couple of 800-word stories, and nobody would have looked at it, and maybe these soldiers would have been treated like any other soldier who was, who had been injured. But because they covered it up, for so many years, it became this gigantic thing, that now suddenly they're grappling with in a much more difficult way than they might have had to.
And the human cost of that cover-up was very much there. These soldiers who had risked their lives, who had suffered tremendously, were being ignored, and that's just the sadness.
Yes, for awards, for medical care, for everything.
But you said something in the intro of this thing, or in the question, about these kinds of stories are not the big money makers or something like that. This is at the core of who we are. This kind of journalism is at the very essence of the brand promise of the New York Times. And one of the greatest challenges that we face as an institution is that we must adapt to a dramatically fast-paced changing environment. That's on the speed of that change is only growing. We can get into that later. But we can't do that and destroy the core of our mission and our purpose for being. And maintaining those two is both the promise and the challenge, and that's what we face.
Well, I would think, what's been interesting in this era when so many news organizations have shut down foreign bureaus and cut back correspondence, that you continue to do this. I mean, do you have to take a long, hard look at the budget each year and try to figure out how do you make this work?
Of course we do, yeah. I mean, we are a business after all, and we are a for-profit business. And making a profit is a core part of what we need to do. But if we're going to sustain ourselves. But the truth is, as the global reach of the Times becomes greater, the joy of the digital era, right? You wake up in Japan, Germany, wherever you happen to be, and you can get that morning's New York Times, right? It's remarkable, and that wasn't the case when you and I were out there as journalists. Means that we have greater opportunity than ever before, but we have to stand up to that opportunity. So yes, we have more foreign bureaus and more foreign journalists than ever in our history. We have more national correspondents than ever in our history, because we must invest in this journalism to succeed.
Well, I will come back to that in a few seconds, but staying on this for a moment. Ian, what kinds of things did you do with a digital strategy that you might not have done in a different era to get the word out about this story?
Right. In fact, it was quite different. Normally our really big pieces of enterprise like this, and this was a very long story. I won't even tell you what Chris originally filed, but it was 8,000 words, which is well over 2 full pages of the New York Times, which is probably a third of a book, a quarter of a book, something like that. He filed, I think, a book for sure. So normally we save these pieces for the Sunday newspaper, which traditionally has had the largest circulation. What was the highest, 1.8 at one time, or even a little more?
1.7, 1.6, 1.7. It could have been 1.8.
Something like that.
Eileen, do you remember? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, we still value, obviously, our Sunday readers very much, because it's a time, I mean, you have a balance between numbers and engagement, and clearly on Sundays, this is probably a little longer than you want to hear, I'm sorry, but on Sunday people have a little more time to read, but there aren't as many readers online. So normally, while this would have gone on a Sunday thinking it's a long piece, people want to step back, we have more readers. In the digital age, we have many, many fewer readers on a Sunday than we do, because people are, outside. So we decided to do it on a day when we have, quite heavy traffic. There were some other ancillary reasons, which was the type of story that it was, which was a very heavily sort of government centered story. It was a story where we felt people would be very socially engaged in it, and people tend to be less engaged on the weekends. And in fact, as of last night, out of the more than 1 million views that it got, half of them came from social, which for us is tremendous, and that's, just to have a small sidetrack, I mean, many of you know that we had this innovation report that talked a lot about our audience and growing our audience, and this was a really excellent example of our audience finding us a new audience and not necessarily seeing it at the New York Times. So anyway, we published this gigantic piece on a Wednesday, not only that, a Wednesday night, which sort of breaks all protocol. I happened to be out of town, and I got in, I didn't go to bed till 3 in the morning, and the traffic on his piece at 3 in the morning was, 10 times higher than a normal story, even then. So this sort of goes back to Arthur's point, if I could just brag on us for a second, and that is that we're making a bet that quality matters. I mean, it's sort of weird. We find that people, I think even if we did have cute pictures of cats, they wouldn't necessarily click on them. I genuinely believe that. I mean, our readers are very peculiar. They really want us to give them something interesting. Sorry to go on.
Arthur, I'm curious, did you get pushback from the government on this piece? I mean, I'm sure you occasionally get those White House phone calls. Did you get anything on this one?
No, I didn't, which is not to say that we didn't. We did get, but not the high level, not the president calling or anything of that nature. Much more low level that worked with Dean and with Joe Kahn.
I mean, it was just very hard. The government simply didn't cooperate. Most of this actually happened during the Bush administration, so in fact, all of it, I believe, because Iraq took over disposal of all its munitions right at the beginning of the Obama term. So it was kind of a different era, so they didn't have that same pushback, but they, it was the Pentagon, and they were not cooperative because there was a bit of embarrassment about it, and still a bit of embarrassment about the Iraq War in general.
Yeah. You got me curious, though. When's the last time you did get one of those phone calls from, whether it was the president or complaining about a story, or top figures?
After a while, they stop complaining, they just don't like it. But, look, this happens on occasion, but, it's happened with us at state level, at city level, at the international level. I think the last big one probably had to do with our China piece. And that was not obviously the U.S. government that was upset, but the David Barbosa piece about the wealth of the families, that was a hard one. And
That won the Pulitzer last year. Yeah.
2 years ago,
2 years
I think?
ago.
2 years
2 years
ago.
ago.
Yeah.
David won a Pulitzer for that. And, but, people get upset by certain stories, and governments get upset by certain stories, but so that happens. And sometimes, to be fair, we always listen. Let's be clear about that. We always listen. That doesn't mean we do what they would like, because generally we don't.
And the China site, by the way, ended up us getting 3 sites in China closed down. So we are not legally functional there, although as many people now are reading our Chinese website as did before they shut us off, because they're very, very clever about finding VPNs and ways around it. So we keep it going at a fairly good pace, even though we don't have any freedom whatsoever.
2 weeks ago, you announced plans to cut 100 newsroom jobs, and through buyouts or layoffs, and that's on top of, from reading the story that you folks put out, another 230 job cuts since 2008. But at the same time, it looks like from your numbers, you've also been hiring. So is this a repositioning of staff to make way for the digital age? Is it a generational shift? What's going on?
All right. So it's a bunch of different things. First of all, it is we have gone through staff cuts in the past, and they're buyouts. They're generally buyouts, and that is a reduction because at any moment, we do have to factor in what's the revenue, what's the cost, and what are the implications. But to your other point, yes, we are reinvesting in our journalism just as we are reinvesting in our digital future on the business side, to be sure. So even though we've had, 3 or 4 rounds of reductions in the newsroom in the past decade, I'm guessing that's roughly right, we have more journalists in our newsroom today than we've ever had in our history, right? About 1,300. We are going to go down some, but yes, we are continuing to hire as well, because the skills, and this is something important for all of you who are here because you are studying journalism and you want to wonder, okay, what is this profession, and is this something I want to be part of? Because the skills necessary to succeed in this world are truly changing, and we can talk more about that as the evening goes on. And so we need people who are more adept at some of the digital the digital skills. And that's not necessarily age-related. Let's be clear. There's some people who are, of more senior ranks or age, if you will, who absolutely get that. Let me think. David Carr.
He does.
Okay, just to pick someone at random. I was just meeting with David earlier today.
Media writer for the business section, columnist.
And amazing man. If you have not read his book on his life, I urge you to do so, because it's a powerful journey. His life has been a very powerful journey.
He was a drug addict who cleaned up his life and got a job at the New York Times, among other places.
So this is not to suggest in any way that going through these cycles is not painful. It is. And it's painful on the business side and on the news side. But yes, we also must reinvest if we're going to make the moves we have to make.
I was also curious, though, how do you deal with morale in the newsroom at a moment like this? I think I've had 3 people, got in touch with me saying, I'm trying to decide whether I should take the buyout. I'm sure it's just a moment that is complicated with people.
And Meryl, what do you tell them?
What do I tell them?
Yes.
I tell them to stay. I tell them
Yeah,
if
is that
they
right?
love what they do, they should keep doing it, and until they can't do it anymore. If there's something else they want to do, then they should go off and do that. That's what I tell them. I love journalism. I'll be doing this as long as I can. So.
Okay. Maybe you could say, look, if you decide to take the buyout, I want you to know I'll be hiring. and you can come work for me. What do you think, Meryl?
Sounds good to me.
How about answering the question, though? You're closer to it than I am. You're in the newsroom.
About morale?
Yeah.
How can I say this?
In front of the boss.
That I'm not so worried about. He's all right. When we had our first cuts, and I believe they were the first in the history of the Times in 2008, it was a gigantic shock. I mean, it was really a thunderous thing. And I don't want to say that we've gotten used to it because we've been investing an enormous amount. I mean, even after the layoffs, we're going to have the same number of editorial employees as we had a year ago. So it's a weird thing to say it's a flat-out reduction. But there's also some level at which people understand that we're not the institution that we used to be. And again, certain skills are more valued at the moment. I mean, the extent to which if you look at it, if you'll just give me a second, I'm sorry. I mean, the Times until not so many years ago was a very boutique organization. It reached 1 million people a year. They were influential. We had regular advertisers who basically catered to a very rich clientele. The joke was in the newsroom that if you worked for the New York Times, you could never afford to buy anything advertised in the New York Times. And over the years, we ha 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 ha. However, ha ha ha, true.
Take that, Bloomingdale's? Wait a second,
Exactly.
I don't buy that.
Excuse me, J&R Cameras did in fact advertise. And now we're a huge, media corporation to some extent, and we don't have the breadth that we had, but we have, some 60 million, readers a month, and as Arthur was saying earlier, we have a reach around the world, and that's really transformed. I mean, I was a foreign correspondent for 10 years, and I lived, in a hotel room essentially alone for 10 years, which can turn a person a little freaky after time. So I'm glad to be back, but the web demands so many different skills and such a level of collaboration. I mean, to the extent now that the New York Times is, for example, a technology corporation in a way that it was not, is extraordinary. We may well have, and Joe, I hope I'm not breaking news, a sort of high-level newsroom tech, chief, which is something we never would have, considered before. I mean, our technology is, and as you saw in, Chris's report yesterday, our technology is as central a part to our journalism as, well, I wouldn't say as central a part, but pretty near a part to our journalism as, interviews and seeking out stories. I mean, they're indistinguishable right now. So there's a long answer, but anyway, come 7 years later, 6 years later, I mean, people understand there's going to be a shift. Does anyone love it? No. The package happens to be very generous. Does that help? Yes. But it's not great. But there is some understanding after so much time and after so much sort of digital water, so to speak, has flown under the bridge or something. That life is changing a little bit, and many people are quite eager to try something different. Again, I'm not saying it's great, but it is.
And if they look around and they see what's happened at other papers and other magazines
an
and other
important point.
institutions, and they see how some have just been devastated, they realize that the Times is still there and is still committed to the quality journalism that binds us all.
I should mention that the Washington Post now has half the number of reporters and editors in the New York Times, so in contrast.
And they have a great editor in Marty Barron, right?
Yes, who used to work for the Times.
And the Boston Globe,
Boston Globe,
which
and
when
yeah.
we owned the Globe, he was our editor at the Boston Globe, and so he's really good now.
Now, some of you may or may not have seen this, but back this spring, the Times put out its own 97-page innovation report, which Arthur Gregg, Sulzberger, Arthur's son, spearheaded. What surprised me most about reading this report is how incredibly critical it was of the Times. And it talked about whether the Times was very resistant, the Times culture was very resistant to change, to moving to digital. They interviewed a number of people who had left the Times, who talked about how unhappy they were and how the culture really was kind of making them feel they weren't welcome there, they didn't have a chance there. how do you change that? You know, that report only came out a couple months ago. How do you change that mindset? And obviously, it's a lot easier to build a whole new digital platform if you're Huffington Post or BuzzFeed, but if you're starting with a print legacy publication,
right.
how do you move this thing?
Well, first of all, that was an excellent report, and I do want to commend the folks. It was, my son did in fact lead the team, but there was a superb group of journalists from the Times who were all part of that team. One just became the assistant international editor, right? She was just announced.
You should read this, actually. It's really worth, you'll learn a lot.
I'm blanking on her name now. Anyway.
Amy.
Amy O'Leary, right? Yeah.
Deputy.
She
She became deputy international
Deputy
editor.
international
Yes.
editor. So it was a really remarkable piece of work. And what I was most proud of is the courage it takes to look at yourself harshly and be honest. I mean, in effect, what that group did was they wrote about us the way they would have written about somebody else. You know, and you know, it was, but I think because it came out of the newsroom was, it quite frankly embraced it. In a way that they wouldn't have if it was coming down from
McKinsey or
McKinsey.
somebody you'd hired,
Right.
yeah.
Also, I think it spoke to some underlying issues that once they bubble up, people start to say, yeah, that's a problem. And it gave people more courage to say to their bosses or their colleagues, you see, I've been saying that for 6 months or 2 years or however long. And the fact that it was followed so quickly by a really remarkable move by Dean Baquet, our executive editor, who reached out into the business side to bring in a very talented young woman who is now assistant managing editor? Associate managing editor. But she comes from the digital world, and she is now in the newsroom to create audience, and it's all about development, right?
Exactly.
And she's really, really remarkable. So the Dean's action said to the newsroom, okay, we know the issues we've got to address. Now here we are starting to lay the groundwork to address those issues, taking real steps. And that took courage, and quite frankly, it's a moment we've long needed. So if you don't have the courage to look at yourself as straightforwardly as we say we have the courage to look at everybody else, who are we really serving?
If I could add just
Sure.
one small thing to that. I mean, obviously, it's not as if, you know, the New York Times has absented itself from, you know, the digital world for the last 15 years. I mean, our website is, in fact, 15 years old. It's been very difficult. Many things about the web are antithetical to, you know, the culture of the New York Times. I mean, we have prided ourselves on being authoritative, on being deliberative, you know, to making sure we get things right, which is why you often see our alerts are slower than, you know, other, you know, newspapers, because we actually call as opposed to quoting somebody else. To really observing a craft, and there's a craft to writing good newspaper stories. And we've gotten in many ways very, very good at certain parts of the digital world. I'm sure many of you saw Snowfall. Our digital storytelling has been excellent. More people are coming to us than ever for breaking news, which is a very exciting thing. The Innovation Report was one of those, you know, moments. A, it came out of the newsroom. B, it was written by incredibly, you know, some of those respected people in the newsroom. I mean, everyone on that group was considered in the absolute top rank. C, I think, was just its absolute bluntness was, guys, really, come on. And it shook up the newsroom. I mean, we've been moving in a certain direction, and it sort of felt like a moment where there's never any looking back. And I think, you know, apart from the very specific prescriptions in the Innovation Report, specifically as it relates to, you know, enlarging our audience and focusing much more digitally internally, it was, I think, a psychological sea change. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
One of the things the report pointed out was that aggregators, like the Huffington Post or BuzzFeed, are actually doing better promoting your stories than sometimes you do.
Right.
So how do you win back those readers?
That is a very good point, that one of the many that we're beginning to now address. And the best example, I think, that I can come up with is Maureen Dowd. So some of you may have heard that Maureen Dowd was in Colorado and imbibed a little brownie, right?
Correct.
A marijuana brownie. And she wrote a wonderful column about this. And the column had just I can't even remember the headline for the column, but it was witty, it was charming, and engaging. Let me tell you what the column headline didn't say. Maureen Dowd in Colorado has marijuana brownie.
Wait,
And-
too much marijuana brownie, I think was the point.
She passed
It's all,
out.
it's all about what your definition of too much is. But the point is, the article, the column was brilliant, but if you went to search and you typed in, oh, yeah, I heard about the Maureen Dowd marijuana, it didn't take you to the New York Times. It took you to the Huffington Post, which said Maureen Dowd marijuana, Colorado. And the result is we said, okay, as more and more people move to search, right, and away from homepage, we still have an incredibly strong homepage, let's be clear, but we have to get much better at search, and we now are building in the capability to have that very good headline that was wonderful, and the subhead that will allow search. So when you type in Maureen Dowd, it'll come to Maureen Dowd's column in the New York Times. There are things we can learn from that. You want to talk more about that?
Yes, there's tons of things we can learn from that. I mean, search is, one part of it. Getting our social audience up
search and social,
is,
Sure, that's okay.
incredibly important. Finding different audiences is incredibly important. I mean, and that, finding those audiences depends on numbers and tools that will actually segment out who it is who's reading you in specific places at specific times. And, you can even get really all super fancy pants and say, well, you can test headlines against different, audiences. People, for some reason, Brazilians love to read the New York Times. I don't know why, but whenever we have a big Brazil story, it gets tremendous traffic. And so you have, many of you probably know this, there are programs that will A/B test headlines and images. And I bet you we could double our traffic if we optimized our pictures, our headlines, and our summaries for our Brazilian audience. So a lot of these things were sort of presaged in the innovation report. I forget what the question was, but
One of the things that made me nervous when I read that report was the mention of possibly personalizing the news. As in, if you're a baseball fan, you might never get basketball news. It strikes me that you head down that corridor and suddenly you're only getting things that you're interested in, but you never get the chance to leap beyond that. And I don't know whether that's a concern of yours if you think about the notion of personalizing your news feed.
I have something to say, and I'll defer to you. Is that okay?
Go for it, big guy.
Sorry, I get this question a lot. I think that Times, and this may be a little bit arrogant, and forgive us, sort of believes it has two values. One are our great stories themselves, again, like Chris Chivers' piece or Dave Barbos's China piece, or frankly, pretty much every day we've got a pretty good basket of pieces. But then I think we're also selling, and I genuinely think we're selling, New York Times judgment as a whole. I mean, the New York Times front page sends a message. These are the things we believe are most important to you. The New York Times homepage sends a message. We believe these, well, in the case of the front page, it's 6 stories. On the New York Times homepage, it's 9 stories. We believe at this very second, as opposed to, to at this, sort of moment in the day, these 9 stories are important to us. And we think, we've very much resisted, NYT me, as they call it, inside. Now, is that an absolute? I think the answer is probably not. In a couple ways, I think that, and again, please, Arthur, contradict me if I'm wrong here. But it used to be an article of faith that the Times was the Times was the Times. Well, except for our international homepage. And so now we're sort of looking to say, well, we have Times judgment, but perhaps it looks a little different on different platforms. On NYT Now, which is our very successful, or at least well-regarded mobile app, it looks a bit different there. It's still the New York Times, but it's different. The smartphone is probably going to feel a little bit different. So we're allowing for, also another thing is that as we're working, sort of slowly but surely on a new homepage. I mean, I think everyone has agreed that the centerpiece of the homepage will be what the business side likes to call our shared experience, which is New York Times judgment in another word. But we'll have different things in case you missed it, just for you. If we notice that you like the book review a lot, up may pop underneath the top stories that we believe are the most important articles that we think are interesting to you. So the answer is it's not one or the other. I think that the Times is capable and absolutely has, we feel a real need to convey our judgment, but we can in many ways, also give readers things that they might be more interested in.
And let's not pretend this is exactly new. My wife, who's sitting right over there, Gabby, she loves to cook. So when the Wednesday, I think, paper comes, do you think her first section she goes to is sports? No, it's cooking, right? It's dining. And, she looks at our cooking app now, NYT Cooking, which, by the way, if any of you like to cook, I urge you to look at this app. It's free. And the truth is, if you were in the world of culture, you've probably read our arts coverage before you got to Biz Day. But if you're in business, you may have read Biz Day first before you got to the Metro section. But if you live in New York, you may have read the Metro section before you got to the International Report. So it's not as though this is unique. We have been doing versions of this in print for 100 and longer years, since 1851, when the New York Times was founded.
My morning routine, and it's probably not the same as the rest of yours, but I get up in the morning, I make the coffee, and then I get the newspaper, and I sit there with great pleasure.
You make the coffee first? What's wrong with you?
But I wonder how long will I be getting my print newspaper? Do you see a 5-20 year range, or a 20-year range, or what is your? And
I made the mistake once of actually answering that question. So let me say this. Print is going to be around as long as readers want it. And quite frankly, while you've all seen that print circulation for all newspapers, the Times included, is dropping, what you don't see is that the number of people who've subscribed to the Times for 2 years or more is stunningly stable. I'm going to say, I'm looking at Eileen, about 620, 650? 850,000 2 years or more? Wow, bigger than I thought. 2 years or more. And we like to say that if you've been a home delivery subscriber for 2 years or more, really, we lose you if you move to a place we can't serve, or we lose you if you move to a place we can't serve. But the truth is that what we're seeing now is the transition is not from print to, the shocking transition is not from print to digital. It's from desktop to mobile. That's where the big shift is taking place. And we're seeing, desktop is just more and more, mobile growth is remarkable. And that's, I think, it may well be that print lasts longer than desktop.
So that's interesting. So you think fewer people reading it on their computers and more running around reading it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I was going to, as you mentioned, the paper was founded in 1851. What many of you may not realize was that Arthur's family, your great-great-grandfather, bought it in 1896. Mm-hmm. And while the stock is publicly traded, there's been essentially family ownership for 118 years. Now, on a personal note, you've got your great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father, all as publishers of the New York Times. You became publisher in 1992.
Right.
But I saw
today's actually my 17th year as chairman.
Well,
The anniversary.
but I've seen those, I've seen those pictures of you on your motorcycle with long hair. Did you ever rebel? Did you feel like you had no choice but to be the publisher of the New York Times? Were there other? Did you want to be a, lawyer or doctor, et cetera, and so forth?
When I was 7, I really wanted to be a fireman in New York City. That was really what I wanted to do. Fireman or cop, I wasn't sure which. No, I always wanted to be a journalist, honestly. And I mean that seriously. I worked at the high school newspaper, and I love being a journalist. And when I graduated college. I was a reporter for 2 years in Raleigh, North Carolina, at a now defunct afternoon daily, the Raleigh Times. Then I went to the AP and worked for 2 years there as a foreign correspondent before I joined the Times in the Washington Bureau, where you and I met in Washington, not Bureau. And then I came and I covered City Hall here in New York for a while. And then I was an assistant city editor for about a year. And then I made a move to the business side.
Was that a hard adjustment?
It was, I was pretty much convinced I would do it for a year, I would hate it, and I would go back to the newsroom and fulfill my life as a journalist and be a happy camper.
Arthur, I remember that first year or so, nobody would have lunch with you. I remember this because you were kind of in the business side, and it was like looking around because you're so used to reporters hanging out together, and oh my God, suddenly the boss's kid, and it was like.
Yeah. But to my chagrin, I wound up selling advertising, and I found out that to my chagrin, I liked it, and I began to move up.
What did you like about it?
Well, I'll tell you how I made it work. When I did a deal, and I was doing investment banking, corporate and advocacy advertising. When I made a deal, I would say to myself, okay, let's say I just sold a page, and back then a page was $30,000 or something like that.
What is it now?
A lot more. If you have to ask, you can't afford it, dear. And I would say, well, I just covered Johnny Apple's wine bill for a year. And I really did. And I say, okay, I just paid for the foreign bureau in London. And I really was able to translate it in my head to supporting our journalism, and that was what made it fulfilling. And I still believe that's really what drives our ad sales teams as much as anything. They get the mission. They really do. They know that what they're doing is supporting the journalism, and that's as important to them as it is to our newsroom colleagues.
But during this last 20 years or so, every single family-owned newspaper that I can think of has been sold. The Binghams in Louisville, the Bankrupts in the Wall Street Journal, and now the Grahams in the Washington Post. Why? What is it about, whether it's your structure, or why haven't people pressured you to cash out, or how come this family hasn't caved yet?
At all. And the truth is, I'm blessed. I mean, I really am blessed by having the family that I have and having the structure that we have. So we have two classes of stock, A and B. The A shares are what you can publicly buy, and I hope many of you do. Please feel free to invest into the New York Times and support us. The B shares control the board of directors. I elect the majority of the board of directors, and the B shares cannot be sold publicly. If you own a B share and you want to convert it, it becomes an A share, and you've just lost all that potential value. The B shares are controlled by the Sulzberger Trust. There are 8 trustees. We spend a lot of time together. They're all cousins, or we're all part of the family, blood and in-laws, equal. In fact, we're all spending the weekend this weekend together in my place up in New Paltz, New York. We stay tight. The Bancrofts fell apart because they never knew each other. They just didn't. They didn't have relationships. We work really hard at having relationships, and there are 6 members of the. I'm the 4th generation, and there are 6 members of the 5th generation currently working at the New York Times, which speaks, I think, volumes to the fact that we are, as a family, committed to this enterprise, and we really are.
It doesn't create for interesting rivalries about who's going to get what job next, or?
Yeah, look, that happens, but that happened in my generation, and it happened in my father's generation. I mean, that happens, okay? The question isn't whether you have a rivalry, it's whether when decisions are made, you say, okay, go ahead, support it. And we saw that happen. We've seen that happen generationally.
I was looking back over some of the things that you've done or happened at the Times during your tenure as publisher. One of the things that seems so quaint now was when you introduced color. You may find this amazing, but the New York Times really was known as the Gray Lady because it was the Gray Lady.
The good Gray Lady, by the way. It was my grandmother, Imogene, who created the phrase. And they've taken out the word good, but it was the good Gray Lady. Yes, Okay, so we will get, no doubt, to some of the issues on all of your minds, and some of them may be challenging. But I've got to tell you, as long, in my tenure as publisher and chairman of the New York Times, I have never received more hate mail than when we announced we were going to color. That is true. I cannot begin to tell you how inundated you are destroying this paper. I will never subscribe. I will never read it again. How dare you? And this was when we announced we were going to be doing it. Of course, the minute we did it, people said, oh, well, yeah, well, that doesn't look so bad. But, change is hard. Change is hard. And it's hard sometimes internally, and sometimes it's hard externally, because people say, no, it's been like that since, Moses. How can you change it? And then you change it, and they say, oh, well, maybe not so bad.
Well, which reminds me, you just ended the chess column, or at least that's what the stories were out earlier this week, and I was curious whether you've gotten equally outraged letters.
I have not received any, a little bit. What now? Oh, no, nothing. I can assure you, nothing will ever, he said, hopefully, nothing will ever be worse than in terms of the response and color. But yeah, I mean, even Jason Blair was as bad, and that was bad. So
I was going to ask you, what is the worst thing you've been through or decision you had to make in this period?
oh, there's so many. I mean, the truth is, no, I don't mean. I mean, look, decisions involving people are always the hardest. That's just true. In terms of, I think, the psyche of the Times, Jason Blair was the hardest, because internally and externally we realized we had let down all of us, our readers, our subscribers, ourselves, in such a fundamental way. And there was one great moment, I think, only with Jason Blair, and that was, and people forget this, it was our reporting that appeared in our paper that showed the depth of how bad it was. I mean, to Howell Raines' credit forever, he assigned 3 or 4 of our top investigative journalists, and he said, I want you to study this, I want you to dig deep, and I swear to you, and he kept his word, I will not edit this piece, and neither will our managing editor. And it was brutal, but it ran in the pages of the Times. And I'm still very proud of that moment of us saying, okay, a little bit like the innovation report, if we don't have the courage to look deep at ourselves, we're not doing our jobs.
Arthur, one of the things you made a priority when you took over was diversity in the newsroom.
Mm-hmm.
As many of you may not know, there was a landmark lawsuit against the New York Times back in 1978 from women, which was then settled. But I know that was very important for you as to making the staff more diverse. You were roundly praised when you initially announced Jill Abramson as the editor, and you were roundly criticized this spring when you fired her. Can you talk a little bit about that decision and what you might have done differently?
Well, I'm not going to talk a lot about it because it is obviously a personal issue. And look, let's be clear about something with Jill. Jill is a remarkable journalist. She's one of the best. And I think the quality of the Times under her in terms of its journalism was fabulous. So I mean that sincerely. There were management issues that arose that had to be dealt with, and I'm not going to get into any depth on that. But I really do believe in Jill, in her journalistic credentials, and in what she gave to the paper over her years. But you put that in the context of diversity, and I think what's important there is, look, we need to be willing to promote people. We need to be willing to take a little bit of risk. We need sometimes that risk will work, and this is true whether it's people or whether it's things like creating new websites or new apps. We haven't gotten to that. We talked about our cooking app. We haven't talked about NYT Now. As some of you know, we had an opinion app that we're now closing down because, quite frankly, it just wasn't working. And I think when you promote someone, you have to hold them just as you have to hold yourself to a certain level of standards, and be willing to accept the fact that sometimes that's going to work and sometimes it's not. And that was the case here, which is not to take anything away from Jill. And I mean this sincerely. She is a great journalist and remains that.
Some organizations, particularly Ken Olin of the New Yorker, were pushing the idea that this was a money-related, sexism-related issue, that she had discovered that she was paid less than other places. She complained, and that was part of the reason.
Just to be clear on something, and Ken has slowly, all too slowly, recognized this, that was not true. What he had done was he had taken only her annual salary. And when you move to a job like executive editor or publisher, you can't just look at annual salary and say that's it. Because compensation, the higher you move in the ranks, the more compensation is in terms of bonus, in terms of 3-year plans, in terms of stock options, in terms of long-term incentive plans, LTIP. Those are all factors. And when you look at all those factors, Jill was being compensated much, much more than what he said in terms of salary. You all know that some CEOs take $1 a year. If you journalists said, by the way, that person's only being paid $1, you'd be laughed out of your newsrooms because you're not taking into account what they made for their bonus, what their stock options are valued, what their long-term incentive, et cetera. So Jill was not being paid in her second year as executive editor the same salary as her predecessor in his 8th year, guess, right? But when you add in the added compensation of bonus, LTIP, stock options, et cetera, she was being paid more.
You can all ask more questions if you want about this later. We're going to change. You were just mentioning that you shut down the New York Times opinion. Now, that was a new thing that you started and ended. How many subscribers did you have, or what made you decide that it wasn't working? What was it about it that? So
one of the most challenging, changes to make in a legacy organization, and is the willingness to risk, to say, okay, we're going to test, we're going to learn, we're going to shut things down, we're going to grow things in different ways. And that is something that I think it's fair to say the Times has been slower than, not than its traditional peers, on the contrary, but than startups. And so we started a series of new apps or new experiences. NYT Now is one. And by the way, if you haven't seen NYT Now, you really ought to. It's a wonderful experience, especially if you take the subway. That's what I go to first when I'm on the subway. But the opinion app simply wasn't attracting the kind of audience that we were hoping for. We learned some things from all of these that we were able to adapt into the cooking app, which came later. So we're testing, learning, adapting, and that's the mentality you're going to see more and more more coming from the New York Times.
I'm curious though, how many hits do you need to make something seem successful to you? I mean, I gather the cooking app has some huge number, right?
And the cooking app, to be fair, is still free. Mm-hmm. But it's not just how many people come to you, it's how long they stay, and how do they re-engage, how frequently they come back. There's a whole variety of things. And there's no one single answer to your question, I'm afraid. It's a whole variety of things. Time spent, size of your audience, the growth patterns, quite frankly, advertising.
Do they subscribe?
And do they subscribe in the first place? Exactly right.
Changing topics, the Obama administration has been surprisingly hostile to the press, more leak investigations than almost any other president that I can think of. And your own reporter, James Risen, still, I gather, is in danger of going to jail. I'm wondering, has that had a chilling effect, you think, on journalism as a whole? If you tell a source that what they say is confidential, you can no longer really guarantee that you'll be allowed to. And I'm wondering is there anything the Times can do to help change that atmosphere besides complaining a lot?
You want to take the first half?
Chilling effect, I guess.
No, I remember. I'm going to have to somewhat punt on this because I've been an editor for so long. I do understand, talking to especially the Washington reporters, that there is not that same, free flow. And again, Arthur, please step in if you know more. But they're still able to, get a good deal of information. It just happens a lot more, I think, covertly. That is, I think, in our opinion, not great for democracy to make it so difficult to get basic facts out of government officials. But I think that has been the case. But, you know, it's not impossible to report by any means at all. I mean, you do have to remember that a lot of leaks are, in fact, motivated by self-interest. And oddly, the Obama administration's prosecution of journalists has not made self-interest go away.
And we're not alone. I mean, the Associated Press has had problems. A lot of
Correct, right.
organizations have had problems. In fact, I was just having lunch with the head of the AP, who's an old friend, Gary Pruitt, and we were talking a little bit about this. I mean, there remains a challenge. I think I hope Holder has said that he doesn't want to see journalists imprisoned under his watch, and I only hope that the Attorney General keeps to his word.
Any theory about why this seems Nixon-esque? You would sort of expected a different administration to be pursuing this.
So this does go back a ways, but Abraham Lincoln, I know. So Abraham Lincoln was president, obviously, we all know the Civil War, but what we don't often remember is that there was this new invention that had come out about a decade earlier. In fact, the editor and owner, I think, of the New York Herald had written in his own newspaper in the early 1850s that he had just witnessed the death of journalism. He wrote, "Literature will survive, but newspapers must fade away." He had just met the Telegraph. Sorry, the Telegraph. He had just met the Telegraph. What happens, of course, is the Civil War breaks out. The Telegraph all of a sudden gets news and information to readers. So all of a sudden there's this battle taking place in Kentucky, and 2 days later there's a story in newspapers about what had happened because the war reporters were able to get the news out. And, well, the Telegraph, Lincoln saw the Telegraph as a huge, huge problem. And we've learned recently about, well, not that recently, but a while back, that every telegram went through an office in Washington that the federal government was running.
I didn't know that.
I know. Most people don't know that. So every telegram went through to make sure that it wasn't. So what is it about Illinois lawyers? That's all I got to say, right? What is it? What's wrong with these guys?
Are there many people here, I'm sure, would love to have a career at the New York Times? Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of backgrounds, qualities, experiences that you're looking for? And I'm also wondering whether hiring patterns have changed. And so many newspapers are shrinking. There used to be a classic, you go work somewhere for a couple of years and there's a path, but I think the path is now different. So,
well, the path is different in some ways and not different in others. I think I noticed that someone from the Boston Globe will be here in a couple of days,
yeah,
right?
They already came. I think
They already came.
Yeah.
Good, wonderful, great paper, by the way. We used to own it, so I can say that. But it truly is a great paper. And I think there's still value in working at a smaller paper. Now, there's some people who start as news
I
clerks.
was 2 years at the Lowell Sun.
Where?
Lowell Sun.
Okay, very good. All right. So you went to the Times as a clerk?
After 2 years.
After those 2 years, okay.
And what was being a clerk then, by the way?
There was this thing, it was called the fax machine. You put a piece of paper in it and somehow it went over wires and something. So I put passed them out. I answered a telephone that was connected to a cord. And actually, luckily, I got to do, speaking of, just the basics, this is awful, actually. There was 2,600 murders in New York in the early 1990s, largely crack-related, and I got to cover quite a few of them. And when you do it under the old-time, Times reporters, who were quite harsh, you learned how to cover a story very, very quickly and accurately, and you really got the basics. And a lot of that hasn't gone away. Thank God there's fewer murders. But one of my favorite reporters at the Times is all of 4 years old, Matt Flegenheimer. And he started as an intern, and he went on Rewrite, and then he went on Transit, and now he's covering City Hall. And so for everything that you talk about, sort of needing digital skills, and he's great on Deadline and filing to the web and all of that. But he's taking a very sort of traditional route to being what I think is going to be a super fine reporter. So anyway, my wife, if I could just add one thing, my wife always looks at me and she always says, "What is a digital reporter? Please tell me that." Is there a Wikipedia page that says, what a digital reporter is? And I always tell her, She says, you can't say. You don't know anything. So, but the fact of the matter is there, as much as I admire the sort of old school way that Matt is coming up, there, so many different ways of, developing talent now. Some people are like unbelievably good coders who are able to take designs and turn them into the sort of template that you saw in Chris Chivers' story. There are people who are, just incredibly good at things like video, things like graphics, graphical reporting, database reporting, just the mere technical skills of binding together your publishing system to all the different platforms that, from mobile to, desktop to, whatever is new. So it's a
Kind of work you're seeing on the Upshot.
yeah, exactly. And also, there are more analytic reporting now. The web. I mean, first they said that TV had turned, newspapers into, much more analytic outlets, and the web has, I think, sharpened that to a degree that, again, you see on Arthur here has a list of the top something or another articles that we've had this year. A lot of them are the Upshot because they have voice, they're snappy, they're about interesting things. Not saying that everything else we cover isn't totally fascinating all the time. However, these happen to be, really good. So anyway, there's a variety of skills and ways of getting there.
And to add to that, so some of it remains the same. Having the ability to be a good journalist, to know how to interview people, to know how to get them to trust you, to know how to go over and over and over and to get things right, and maybe not push out, oh, this person was the marathon bomber in Boston, and have that go all over the place, and by the way, identify a totally innocent person, in fact, two innocent persons. But to really say, okay, I'm going to hold off till I know that what I'm reporting is accurate.
The Times didn't
But-
get caught on that, did
No, we did not get caught on that. We didn't get caught on that. We also didn't report the Supreme Court decision the wrong way, the way that 3 or 4
Outlets
news organizations
did,
did. But then there's the other new skills. I mean, the truth is, when we were younger, we'd write our stories, an editor would hammer us, we'd get a final version out, then we'd go to the bar, we'd have a couple of drinks. Because we knew that the story went to the printing press, the papers would be loaded onto trucks, trucks would be delivering it to outlets and to people's homes. Well, guess what? Reporters now are their own delivery system, and they have to take responsibility for getting their stories out to the world. And that is a skill that we have to train ourselves in. We have to understand how to do that and make ourselves better, because we're now responsible in the ways that were unimaginable earlier for getting our journalism out to the people who matter.
Do you have are individual reporters responsible for tweeting their own pieces now versus an entity within the Times that does that for them?
More and more, and we're putting digital editors on every desk to help ingrain in our editors and our journalists are here are the social skills necessary to get this story out. You want to talk more about that since you're running that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all of the desks have, over the years adapted in, one way or another toward, one part of, certain parts of, the changes caused by digital. It's largely been sort of more purely, journalistic. We want to get something up quickly. We want to break news and tell the world. Our challenge now, as the innovation report made very, very clear, is now finding new audiences, and that's something that's going to be increasingly done on the desks themselves, the same desks that are producing the journalism, that actually produce the journalism for our web and print reports. It's essential. They know who their audience is to some degree. They know what's likely to work. We desperately need it, and we put a lot of thought into the Chivers, plan. I personally think that quality is rewarded, and I have a sneaking suspicion Chris Chivers would have had a large audience no matter what. But I think that our care in finding his audience helped.
And we're learning to do this better and better. Earlier we were talking about the Maureen Dowd column. But we've now been able to integrate a lot of this learning in a way. The sports department has been remarkable on this. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that our coverage of the World Cup if you had done a search for the World Cup, New York Times would come first, because we had built in all of the lessons that we'd learned over the past period of time, and we integrated it in how we're thinking about our coverage, how we're positioning it journalistically, but also how we're positioning it from a digital experience, social, et cetera.
No, our if I could just add something, our traffic from the World Cup, just by a few simple search traffic, excuse me, SEO tactics, was sort of deliriously ridiculous. It was really great. I mean, I think we outpaced, and more, Eileen, maybe you know better, our Olympics coverage by maybe 10%. I mean, excuse me, 10 times, 200%. It was something crazy, just by paying a lot of attention to search and to our audience, et cetera.
So now we're going to do the scariest thing in journalism, which is basically we're open to questions.
And reporters hate being asked questions, by the way. We like it the other way
I'll
around.
let you-
Do I get to choose?
Sure.
That's your job. Okay, I'll choose. Go ahead. Hi, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Clancy over there. I have two questions. I'll be very quick with the first one, because the first one's very selfish. I was very surprised to hear that that Brazil has you had so many Brazilian readers, and especially with the World Cup having been and the Olympics coming up. My question is, are you open and inviting for Brazilian journalists to write for the New York Times? And can we talk about this briefly after all this?
He's the one with the money.
No. Seriously?
I don't see why not. We have reporters of all different nationalities. In fact, I have to say that I think during my own years as a reporter, we were probably more open to international journalists than we'd ever been. Part of that was a function of war, in that we went to a lot more places and needed people. Partly it was a function of transparency. After Jason Blair, I mean, a lot of times people who helped us weren't recognized as much. But the answer is we have quite a few international journalists, and we have nothing against it.
So for you and for others, here's what we'll do. If you have a card you'd like to give us, we have people at the Times who are responsible for hiring journalists, for helping journalists, and we can certainly pass your information on to them. All right? But we're not here to hire you, I'm afraid. Sorry.
But my legitimate question, non-selfish question, if that's all right. We haven't really talked about the paywall, and obviously you guys have a paywall. It's a good system, but there's also that issue of the private browsing, and what are you guys doing about that? Is that something that's been?
And when you say private browsing, you mean?
When you can go on Google and use the private browsing function, or
exactly.
I guess.
Or deleting your cookies and every couple of days, right? Look, if what you're talking about is the fact that we made our wall porous so that we allowed for social, we allowed for search, the answer is yes, we did do that. And are there people who, quite frankly, abuse that to get past our quote, pay model? The answer is yes. And it's not dissimilar, quite frankly, than a few years back, if you ran quickly down the street and you grabbed the New York Times from the door, from the paper seller, and you kept on running, that's, sort of a non-digital version. It's called theft, right? So in a way, you just have to say, okay, do I believe in the mission enough to support it? Or do I not care enough? And by the way, I'm going to just steal it. And you're right, people can do that. I hope you don't anymore.
All right, next I'll pick.
Hi, how's it going? My name is Vinay Manda, and I have one question in two parts. The first is, what is your view on online native advertising, and do you feel that it's a sustainable business model for an online media?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second half.
Do you feel it's a sustainable business model?
Native advertising, we call it paid posts. The answer is absolutely we do, and we actually have been doing a lot of it of late, and it's highly effective. So and the key thought is that we want to ensure that readers, people who come to us, users, don't confuse the advertising with the journalism. And I think we've created a model that clearly delineates what is an advertisement, including a paid post advertisement, which is can be a very good experience. And if you've not seen what we did with Orange is the New Black, I highly commend that to you. But yes, it is effective, and quite frankly, we do support it. And we actually have journalists now who are not part of the newsroom of the New York Times, but who work in creating a digital journalistic experience for the ad department that we use. Yeah.
I should say just briefly that, if it's okay, I think it is, that the advertising department was incredibly consultative with the newsroom in terms of, is this appropriate? Does this cross any lines? Is this clear enough? Is this misleading? And I think most of us, some people, didn't like it just in concept, but I think in general people felt that it was done properly.
And Tom Bodkin, who was is our design director from the newsroom, but now overarching, he was responsible for the design to make sure that delineation was clear. And it's like, in a way, the print version would be a standalone section like, I don't know if some of you may have seen in yesterday's paper, we had a section called Russia Today, I believe, something like that. It's an ad. It's a standalone section. It's an ad, clearly an ad. But, yeah.
Next.
Hi, I'm Emily Pushback. I have a follow-up to the part where Obama predicts that the foreign policies complaints. Has that happened with other world leaders? Or have you had complaints? Thanks. Have you had complaints from like people high-ranking in the government out of the United States, and especially in Germany? Does that happen? Maybe not you in person, but Mrs. Abramson or.
I can honestly say I've never had the German chancellor call me. But yes, we get complaints from other governments, very much so. And you were on the foreign desk for a number of years.
No, I wouldn't say. I think people complain to the individual correspondents. I was, having worked in many dozens of countries, I've gotten my fair share, but never from the top, I wouldn't say. No, I've heard that the Pope occasionally wasn't crazy about our coverage, but I didn't hear from him or his boss either, so I don't know.
But yes, we have had it on occasion. Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm David Ballard. I'm a political risk analyst based here in New York. My question really speaks to using sources who reveal classified information. I was in Libya when the whole Edward Snowden thing started coming out. If both of you could speak to Snowden, patriot, traitor, something in between. Opinions?
Journalistic source. Look, I'm not going to call him a patriot. I'm not going to call him a traitor. And I mean that sincerely. There was a time when we would not identify who gave the New York Times the Pentagon Papers because he was going to be considered a traitor. And, now it's all out and that's over. But at the end of the day, we get information and we have to make sure we're comfortable publishing it. All right? There are things we hold back. There just are. We make that decision regularly. Yes, we've just learned that. No, we're not going to publish that because we feel that is detrimental in a fundamental way. Whether it's what's the one I'm trying to think of that we knew where the Russian sub had sunk off the coast of Hawaii. And we knew that for a long time. And we never published it because we knew the U.S. government was going to try to get to it and learn what they started, obviously during the Cold War. This is decades ago now. There are stories that we know, so we make that decision on a regular basis. So we will get information, we will then vet the information, and we will make our own decision as to whether or not this is valuable enough for democracy that we really, even though it's potentially dangerous, needs to get out, or whether, quite frankly, the game's not worth the risk.
It's not my job as an editor to put labels on Snowden. I will say that a definition of what's secret and what's classified is highly subjective. I don't know what the difference was between the first chemical shells that were found in Iraq and why those were completely, made public between, and the rest of the 5,000 that came out, in the years after that. So, I mean, I think to some degree, the nature of a government is to shield. In the case of these bombs that, Chris Chivers wrote about, I mean, had they just been honest about it, if it weren't, quote, classified, if it weren't hidden, would it have been such a big deal? I mean, clearly there are things that are big deals. I was involved very much in there were 3 parts of WikiLeaks and the second and third part of WikiLeaks. And again, as Arthur said, there were certain things that were very clearly not so hot to, reveal, and we were very careful about it. I mean,
WikiLeaks is a great example.
Right? No, you go ahead. I don't know how much we've gone into this, but we actually were so careful with WikiLeaks in terms of, jeopardizing human life, for example, and Chris Chivers was involved in this. I hope it's okay. Eileen, I hope I can say this, but we actually redacted flight times. Which sounds stupid. Why would you redact flight times? Well, flight times can give potential enemies information about where certain things took off and landed. When we decided that the actual specific locations weren't relevant to the information, but rather a mere thing happened. So that's probably more than you want to know. But the point is that we're really, very careful.
We redacted names of farmers in Afghanistan who had given information to Canadian troops going by. The first round, there were 3 tranches of WikiLeaks. The first tranche, we were working with the Guardian. Was it the Guardian? I think so. And we worked very closely, and we made all these redactions, and we published, and WikiLeaks put all of the papers up.
Unredacted.
Unredacted. And I mean, that farmer is dead. The second tranche, we did something very similar. WikiLeaks put everything up, and they got under such criticism from their supporters that on the third tranche, WikiLeaks was following our edits.
Any more? Yeah. We lost the microphone somehow. Pass it over here.
Hi, I'm Jesper Van Kilde. I'm a visitor from Denmark, Politiken Daily reporter there.
Greetings.
Was happy to visit the Times in DC yesterday and in New York today. I asked some of your reporters a question they couldn't answer. So I'm going to ask you, how come there's colors on some of the pages and not on others?
Because the printing presses are made that way.
Is it money?
No, it's literally
They thought.
It's literally the number of pages we produce, and in order to get the speed necessary to produce the volume of papers we produce, not every page can have color on it. But in fact, we are adding color capability to our presses right now, so actually there will be more and more interesting page colors to come.
Just to follow up, it's a bit funny because you see many other papers don't have colors. And
how many pages are they?
I don't know.
But that's important. If you're a 20-page paper, having color on every page is not a problem. When you're 100, it's a bear.
In Denmark, it would be completely inconceivable, a paper without colors. It's just a funny, I don't even criticizing it, it's just funny.
Yeah. No, it is just a production thing. It
Okay.
really is. Yeah.
Cool.
Let's see, back there.
Rosemary Gordon. Is part of the problem between print and the web? Thank you. The fact that we still, and not just at the Times, but everywhere, have not found a way to truly monetize the web so that we could pay that year's worth of wine on the web instead of in print.
A year's worth of wine for Johnny Apple, right? There's no question that the advertising on the web is not equivalent to the advertising in print. And indeed, mobile is even a bigger challenge. The old phrase was digital, it goes from print dollars to digital dimes. Well, now it's mobile pennies in advertising rates. That's why we put in the pay model that we all support, right? Thank you. Because at the end of the day, we've learned that our consumers value what we do and will pay for it. That's true in print, and it's absolutely true on the web. And so we now have over 50% of our revenue now comes from circulation, print and digital circulation. And when I was in ad sales, I think it was 80% advertising, 20% circulation. That was, of course, before the web. So it's been a major shift. But the good news is we have the ability to grow that digital circulation globally now. And the more we grow it, obviously, the more revenue we'll take in. Also, the more we grow it, the more advertising does come in. And we're still searching, the world is now, not just the Times, for the best mobile advertising model. And everybody is searching for that. Facebook is, we all are. And that'll happen, but it's going to take some time.
I've got two over there. Why don't you go one after the other? You two, you're looking at each other.
Hi, my name is Reina Vazlu. I'm a journalism student at NYU. I was looking to find or follow you on Twitter, and I noticed that it says the account was suspended. Is there any way you can explain or elaborate your thoughts on Twitter?
Actually, I thought I shut it down entirely. So let me go back and yes, no, I was experimenting with Twitter and experimenting with Facebook for a while, and quite frankly, I just didn't spend the time necessary with it. So that was just there was nothing more than that. It was just my decision to say, okay, I've already got enough on my plate. I'm just not going to do that. So it was that simple and shallow.
All right.
Hi, I'm Ambika. I'm a journalism student here as well. As you mentioned, the path to getting a job at the New York Times has changed. So is it still good enough to just be a good writer, or are you also actively seeking more diverse skills?
The answer is yes.
It is always good enough to be a good writer. I mean, you have to, of course, write things that are accurate and true. Some very good writers don't. But yes, if you're a good and true writer, you will find a job.
But let's be clear. If you're up against 30 good writers, and 10 of them are not only good writers, but also bring the digital skills, we're going to go for that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Yeah. This gentleman here.
Yeah, sorry.
has
Yeah.
My question is a business one. After more than 3 years of advertising declines, do you believe that the Times can return to advertising growth? And as a follow-up, can the paid digital strategy continue to mitigate those losses, even if it slowed or eventually hit a ceiling?
Well, first off, the shift is really from print advertising to digital advertising, and we're seeing growth in digital advertising. Now, that doesn't mitigate the dollar decline in print advertising, but it does allow for us to begin to see advertising growth in digital, and that's our future. As I said, we actually continue to grow in digital subscriptions, and that's not everything is up every day, every week, every month, but it's been strong. It's been good. And our challenge now is to grow it not only nationally, but internationally. And our new CEO, not so new anymore, Mark Thompson, formerly the head of the BBC, brings a number of skills, many of skills, but among them are his ability to grow internationally. So we're starting to see some more positive developments there. And we still have work to do to make that an easier process. Right now, if you want to subscribe to the New York Times and you're in Denmark or anywhere else, you have to do it in dollars, so we're in the middle of changing that, making it easier to subscribe in your own currency. So there are little steps we can take as well as larger steps we can take to grow our digital platform globally, and that's something we're looking at, committed to.
And you've had a question back here.
Hi, my name is Virginia. I'm looking
I'm curious about International New York Times and what's the strategy behind it. I noticed that you have merged the website way before that, and a year ago in Indonesia we actually have International New York Times in the newsstand. From what I understand, the new media is really important, and is it a step back to have the print edition of International?
So what we really did is a rebranding. We have owned the International Herald Tribune for many years, and we simply rebranded that existing product, the International New York Times. So it is not a new product, it is a rebranding. And we've invested in the quality of that journalism as well, of course, but the focus remains on growing digitally, let's be clear about that. The joy of having a unified newsroom means that when New York is falling asleep, you know, Hong Kong is waking up, and Hong Kong can now affect the experience. And when Hong Kong is starting to go down, Paris is waking up, and Paris and London, where we have. So we want to make a global 24-hour news experience especially for our international readers. And as you probably saw, you could toggle on that website from the International New York Times version to the non-international, the New York Times. And that allows you to have both experiences.
We're waiting on a few more, Stephanie?
Hi. Oh. Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I'm a journalism student here at NYU. I was just wondering, in terms of your ratio of freelance writers versus staff writers, and do you seem to be hiring more freelance writers or leaning more towards staff writers? Is it changing at all?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see that going?
I think it depends on the section. I mean, our news sections have been largely driven by staff writers. Some of our feature sections, like travel, for example, are nearly entirely freelance. I think that ratio is kind of the same, depending. We have had some cutbacks in freelancers, but I don't see any gigantic change, no.
Elise, you had a question?
Hi, my name's Elise. I'm a student here as well. And I was just wondering what social media site brings you the most traffic right now?
Facebook by far. I mean, Facebook really, people always say, well, I shouldn't say it. Facebook is very influential, and it drives a lot of traffic for us.
But there are others as well, and it depends
Yes.
on. I mean, sometimes
No,
it's
Twitter.
Politico.
One of the greatest things of all time is to get a Reddit link. I mean, it makes us really, really, really happy, because it will, of course, be the only time my sons read a New York Times story. But Facebook's the most important.
But it's funny that every night there's an overnight report that goes out, and among the things it notes is the traffic. The stories are getting the most traffic, and a little bit of why. Are they coming from various sites? And it's funny, even today, the Drudge Report can still occasionally cause a story to spike.
The Drudge Report, he's probably going to hate me saying this, so I'll say it very clearly. I love the Drudge Report. Please link us as often as possible, and particularly if you link us in a bad way, we really appreciate that. Anyway, they're really, hats off to him in all seriousness. His site is capable of driving enormous traffic.
It's very funny.
Yeah, and it's a very good... HuffPo, yeah.
Sometimes.
Oh, sometimes, it depends.
Yeah, it really does.
I'm sorry?
Oh,
Yes,
Oh, yeah,
yes,
yeah,
there's no question.
But absolutely.
We've got time for one or two more. You've been trying for a while?
My name's Sean. I'm a journalism student. I also work at the student newspaper as a multimedia editor. And you talked a little bit about reinvesting in different skill sets to address the digital age. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of video, both in terms of producing content and revenue.
Good question. I was curious about that too.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I think.
Video has obviously become much more important to both our journalism and I'll let Arthur talk about this, our business strategy. In terms of business, I mean, certainly it's one of our only pieces of content that actually has a revenue number put on it. I mean, you can't say what a Chris Chivers article is worth. You often can say what a video is worth, which makes it a unique thing. But video, I'll say a couple quick things about it. I mean, we had a video recently. I mean, the first thing is that, once again, as with everything with the we believe at the Times, quality is the most important thing. Any amount of gimmicks or cuteness or whatever just doesn't count. Our biggest video, I believe, and again, Eileen, tell me if this is wrong, of all time was this ISIS video we had recently, which was about a survivor of an ISIS massacre. Awful story, really miserable. I think we got 2 million clicks off that, something like that. That's a lot of reach on an incredibly important subject. So video is central to our journalism and our business, I believe.
Yeah, and more recently even than that is the video out of Liberia on the Ebola. It's up today.
Just up today.
Just up today. I mean, it is so painfully stunning. I mean, it really brings home what a tragedy and what little resource there is there to handle this painful tragedy in a real powerful way. And yes, to the point Ian made earlier, video is monetizable, that's the word, in a way that, because there's a clear advertising experience attached to it. So it's good from a business perspective, but it's also great because it brings our journalism to a new level of life. So it's a mixture of those two. We still focus very much on print, but and you were talking earlier about our snowfall, right? Which I hope some of you have seen. The ability to go from print directly to a video, back to print, directly to a video, and you'll be reading about the survivor of this terrible moment, and all of a sudden there she is, talking to you about what it was like to be under all that snow. And then you go further in the story. It's that immersive experience that is one that we really are engaged in creating and bringing to deeper and deeper life.
If I could just elaborate on one larger point. I don't think that video, in the same way that crappy words are just crappy words, a crappy video is a crappy video. So there's nothing specific about there is something specific about the medium and what it can tell. But again, it depends really on the quality. So saying, oh, we have a video means absolutely zero. The question is it good? And that's what counts.
You're so well spoken.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's right.
One thing I wanted to throw out, because we hadn't talked about it, you mentioned Ebola, but I was thinking about part of the job that you have all the time is sending people in harm's way. You had Alyssa Rubin, who was seriously injured in a helicopter crash. You had Anthony, who died, Judy, who died. And I'm wondering now, as you look at what's going to happen with Ebola and the sort of panic going on, kind of how you're preparing, thinking about this, putting together, I presume, teams of resources to deal with it.
Of course. I mean, look, we put a tremendous amount of effort into this and, quite frankly, money. I mean, just to be clear, over the last decade, in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere, we have lost more reporters than we lost in World War II. We've lost more reporters than we lost in World War I. We've lost more reporters than we lost in Korea and Vietnam. All those wars put together, we have lost more reporters in the last 10 or 15 years because there's no front line anymore. And the result is it's hard to protect if you're going to be a journalist out there. It's very, very hard. It's brutal. And it's terribly, terribly sad, and that's a reality. But you've been part of that, so.
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time in war zones, and I am going to. This could sound like I'm shamelessly kissing up to my boss, but Arthur has been astounding in protecting Times journalists. Basically, no expense was ever spared, from things as simple as, sandbags to, I think at one point in the Iraq Bureau we had something like 60 guards, two of which wanted to kill us, which provided a new, sort of dimension of danger. But I have to say, sorry, Arthur, it's one of the great things that's for working with, for this particular family, is actually care about the people. And he and the family have taken enormous care of people who have been out in the field, keeping us safe. Now, there are places like, we are not covering Syria, which is, a gigantic journalistic hole. But we just won't risk our people like that. There isn't, even though many people risk, their lives for stories, there actually isn't one that's worth dying for.
All right, let me take one or two more, and then I promise you we'll be out of here. All right.
Yes, please, a happier question before we
Yes.
end. All right, thank you. One last question.
I'm Cecil McCarthy. My class, Journalistic Inquiry, is here reporting on this talk tonight. And you did just mention Syria, and I'm wondering, what is your policy on reporting on hostages taken by ISIS or other terrorist groups? You pretty much go dark, and then at some point you decide to go public. So is there a policy? Is it a case-by-case basis? How do you decide when you actually are going to report on instances like that?
I think I'd rather not say, thank you. It's very complicated, and it largely depends on the safety of people, and so I'd rather not.
Well, we can say.
We know
let's
there are
not-
two Americans still being held right now
Exactly.
by ISIS.
So let's agree, we're not going to talk about people who are currently being held, but I think David Rode is a very good example of what we can do. We knew that David Rhodes was a reporter for the Times. He's now at
Reuters?
Reuters, I think.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, Reuters.
And we knew that David was being held hostage for a very long time. We didn't know where, we didn't know what conditions and all that. We knew he was missing. And we did not report that, no, because we're not going to put lives in danger simply to say, well, we know that Sam Smith is captured. So we are very careful about that, and we're very careful about when we do put it out, and that's just true. It's been true for many, many years.
And without how do I want to say this? Without taunting you in any way, ISIS is very, very sophisticated. It gets its message out about what you should and shouldn't be doing, or what they prefer you did or didn't do. I think in ways that might be surprising.
Thank you both for coming and for
Thank you,
spending so much
Meryl.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Meryl, for this conversation.